Hello to all lovers of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. If you enjoy stories that send chills down your spine and keep you awake at night, get ready, because this one, oh yes, this one is truly something else. The stories. What a delivery driver saw outside the last house on the route. The incident reportedly came from a route sheet pulled from an old regional dispatch office, and it referenced a final stop that never made sense. The archived note mentioned a driver who claimed someone waited outside the last house even after the street was cleared. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a delivery driver for a regional shipping line that handled late evening drop-offs. He lived in a small rented place near a quiet highway spur and tried to keep his nights predictable. He clocked in around sunset and followed the route grid until everything on the manifest was scanned. He liked that rhythm and needed the extra hours after rising fuel prices drained his budget. The night that changed him came in early autumn of 2019 when a mild drizzle pushed across the county roads. His simple goal was to clear the last 4 stops before 9 so he could get home. The final house sat at the far edge of a sparsely built neighborhood where new construction had stalled after funding issues slowed development. Rylan reached the second-to-last stop without trouble and scanned the small parcel while a porch light flickered behind the occupant. He waved, returned to his truck, and checked the tablet. The final address displayed a short note that read, "Gate partially damaged. Approach with caution." He thought it sounded dramatic, but he kept moving because delays meant more paperwork. The dirt road to the final house felt different because the gravel ruts were deeper than they looked on satellite maps. His tires shook through the uneven track, and he slowed so the cargo would not shift. He remembered the drizzle turning into a steady fall that made the old fence lines appear faded. His truck headlights cut across the trees while the route timer beeped. The house came into view as a single-story structure with siding worn by years of heat. An old pickup sat beside the carport with its door cracked open like someone left in a hurry. Rylan stepped out, grabbed the padded envelope, and noticed a figure standing near the tree line. The person faced the house and barely moved. Rylan called out because it seemed natural. The figure did not answer. He felt uneasy, but walked toward the porch because the package needed a signature. He knocked on the weathered door and waited until a woman in her 40s answered with tired eyes that hinted at several sleepless nights. Her name was listed as Marquez, and she signed without looking away from the tree line. She whispered that someone had been standing there for 3 nights. Rylan glanced back toward the trees and saw the figure slowly turn, as if reacting to the porch light. He asked Mara if she knew who it was. She said no and explained that local deputies had driven by earlier but found no footprints. She added that her dog refused to go outside after dusk. Rylan tried to reassure her, but he felt tense when the figure stepped closer. He returned to his truck and logged the delivery while watching the silhouette move with an unusual stiffness. He noted that the figure wore a long coat that flapped in the wind, yet the shape underneath did not shift. He heard a soft tapping on his side mirror and thought it was a branch until he noticed no branches reached that far. He started the engine and pulled slightly forward. Mara called out from the porch, asking him not to leave yet because she feared the figure might approach her door again. Rylan kept the truck idling and stepped out with his phone raised. The figure paused near the edge of the driveway and tilted its head as if listening. Rylan recorded a short, shaky video for possible evidence and captured the moment the figure retreated into the dark corner of the lot. He urged Mara to call the non-emergency line again. She did and mentioned his presence in the background. Dispatch reportedly confirmed previous calls from that address during the same week. Rylan waited until she hung up, then walked toward the driveway entrance to check for tracks. The drizzle had softened the soil, but he noticed 2 long impressions in the mud that did not match any standard boot pattern. He crouched to inspect the impressions and realized they looked stretched, as if the heel marks dragged unnaturally. He took photos to document it because the deputies would need something clear in case the rain erased the evidence. When he stood, he saw movement near the abandoned construction lot behind the house and raised his phone again. The figure reappeared near an unfinished foundation block. Rylan shouted, asking what they wanted, and the figure responded with a faint rattling sound that could have been fabric or gear. It stepped behind the block and vanished from sight. Rylan reached the spot within seconds, but found nothing except a plastic tape marker used by survey crews. He picked it up and noticed someone had written a date that predated the stalled project by 2 years. Mara approached carefully and said previous owners told her strange things about that construction lot. She reported hearing scraping sounds at night and seeing floodlights flicker without power issues. Ryland suggested checking the old project files because developers usually left public records. Mara said she tried, but half the records were archived manually before digital conversion. Ryland offered to look at the files later because he had experience sorting scanned documents from a part-time job years earlier. She thanked him and pointed to the tree line again. The figure stood there once more, closer than before, and seemed to watch them without any visible breathing motion. Ryland backed away and urged Mara to go inside. He waited in his truck until deputies arrived. They swept the area with flashlights and found nothing except the strange impressions in the mud. One deputy mentioned similar calls from another street where witnesses described a silent watcher near multiple houses. He said the figure always retreated beyond the last visible yard before vanishing in the dark. Ryland drove home late and reviewed his video. He noticed a faint reflection on the figure's coat that resembled a badge clip or small tool. He zoomed in and saw a blurred shape that matched old utility company tags from the early 2000 era. Employees sometimes wore heavy coats during winter maintenance, and older coats used reflective threading around the collar. The next day, he visited a small records desk at the county office. He asked about utility work in the stalled development. A clerk pulled a faded binder that listed crew rotations from 2001 to 2003. One name had several warnings about night shifts, where the worker logged extended hours without partner verification. A final note mentioned an unresolved disappearance during a routine inspection after a severe storm. Ryland compared the coat description from the old files to the figure in his video. The match seemed close, but not perfect. He requested access to old lot surveys and found a handwritten report describing a flagged hazard trench near the exact foundation block where the figure vanished. The report stated the trench was filled without proper inspection because storms destroyed monitoring equipment. He returned to Mara later that week and showed her the findings. She said deputies had returned twice and installed a temporary sensor light. She had not seen the figure since the previous night, but her dog still refused to approach the tree line. Ryland and Mara walked to the construction lot and checked the ground. The soil had settled unevenly, suggesting a collapse zone beneath the surface. Ryland believed the figure might be a residual impression or a person reenacting old patterns from a job that ended abruptly. He shared the theory with Mara, and she nodded, relieved to hear something grounded rather than supernatural. They both agreed the coat and the strange movements could indicate someone reenacting a memory or suffering confusion while hiding from help. The county eventually fenced the lot after a safety inspector confirmed unstable ground. Ryland moved to a different route by winter and rarely saw the neighborhood again. He kept the video and photos in a private folder and updated dispatch about the gate note so new drivers would avoid the unstable area. He thought about the figure sometimes when rain hit the windshield during his late runs. The memory stayed sharp because the silence in that yard felt heavier than the weather. He never claimed to know the full truth, but he trusted the possibility of a confused worker returning to a familiar site. He understood that some routes go beyond simple deliveries. He believed the last house had carried a story that lingered longer than any scanned package. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up 2 old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer. almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. This photograph found in a mailbox changed everything. The photograph turned up inside a rusted mailbox behind an old duplex that once housed 3 families during the late 2010s. It reportedly connected to an unsolved disturbance that drew police cars for weeks without any formal statement from local officials. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a junior claims adjuster who spent most days reviewing accident photos sent by clients across the region. He had driven out to the duplex to help his cousin move into a cheaper place after a messy breakup that happened earlier that year. He wanted a quiet afternoon with simple tasks that could end before dark, since the neighborhood felt uneasy even in daylight. The plan changed when he noticed the leaning mailbox behind the fence with its lid jammed open from years of sun damage. Something inside caught the light in a way that bothered him, and he reached in without thinking much about it. His hand closed on a stiff envelope with no stamps and only a smudged date that looked like it read 2014. Inside was a single photograph that showed the back lot of the same duplex, with a figure standing near a basement door. The figure seemed to stare at the camera, even though the face was blurred under the bright reflection that hit the glossy print. A handwritten note on the bottom edge read, "He never left," and the words felt rushed, as if written during real fear. Rylan showed the photo to his cousin, who shrugged and said the basement had been locked for years due to repeated flooding. His cousin had heard faint stories from the previous tenant, who claimed someone used to sleep down there during colder months. Nothing in the story felt sharp enough to explain the strange energy captured in the photograph. Rylan slipped the photo in his backpack, then walked around the duplex yard for a better look at the angle shown in the print. He matched the line of the fence and the shadows from a nearby power pole until he reached the exact spot where the unknown person once stood. His phone timestamp showed late afternoon, yet a sudden chill moved through the air even though the day had been warm. He took a quick photo of the canal behind the duplex to document conditions, since he handled evidence types for work and trusted that habit. Something shifted behind the basement door, and he stepped back while telling himself it was only loose wood pushed by the wind. The handle rattled once, which unsettled him more than he expected. A neighbor named Corby Henshaw walked out from the adjacent unit and asked if Rylan was looking for the old inspector who used to check the lot. Corby looked about 50, and carried a half-empty grocery bag that gave off a faint scent of detergent and onions. He said the inspector came around every few months to confirm no one had broken into the basement. Ryland showed Corby the photo, and the man stiffened before saying he recognized the reflection pattern on the figure's jacket. Corby claimed the image matched a maintenance worker named Talon Griggs, who vanished from the property in late 2014. According to Corby, the disappearance never gained attention because Talon was young and moved often without telling anyone. Ryland asked if police ever searched the duplex, but Corby said they mostly checked paperwork, then suggested Talon left town for seasonal work. Corby lowered his voice and explained that several tenants reported hearing dragging sounds under the floor during storms after Talon went missing. Ryland listened with growing concern because the basement clearly leaked heavily and could hide debris without much notice. He returned to the basement door and studied the warped wood for any sign of fresh marks that might show recent attempts to enter. A faint groove near the latch suggested someone had slipped a tool inside within the last few months. His job trained him to recognize forced entry signs even when the damage seemed minor. Ryland decided to search public records at the small municipal office across town to see if any maintenance reports mentioned Talon. An older clerk named Mavis Kelter helped him check archived building logs that covered routine inspections and emergency calls. She located a brief entry from late 2014 stating that the maintenance worker assigned to the duplex never completed his shift. The entry ended with a note about a tenant hearing a loud crash near the canal path behind the property that same evening. No follow-up report existed, which troubled Ryland because something clearly disrupted the worker's schedule. Mavis encouraged Ryland to check the microfilm station since older incident summaries sometimes went unprocessed in the main system. He scrolled through grainy reels until a short police dispatch log from early the next morning appeared with a simple description of possible trespasser behind duplex. The log ended without resolution, yet two initials of responding officers matched names Ryland recognized from regional accident investigations. It remained unclear why the officers never wrote a complete summary. Ryland contacted a former coworker who now handled risk assessments for vacant structures and asked if he recalled any issues near that duplex. The coworker remembered an odd request from a landlord who wanted an estimate for reinforcement of a basement hatch rather than a full cleanup. That recommendation was denied due to insufficient documentation, which meant the door probably stayed weak for years. Ryland returned to the duplex the next morning and found the backyard quiet except for the hum of distant traffic along the main road. He held the original photograph beside the current view and noticed a missing gutter downspout that once directed runoff away from the basement. Water had carved a shallow trench that led directly to the exact spot where tenants heard dragging noises during storms. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear against the wood to check for echoes that could reveal hidden cavities behind the interior wall. A faint hollow sound suggested a gap large enough to hide debris that might include personal items left by Talon. He reached for the handle, which gave slightly, as if someone recently replaced a rusted hinge without securing it tightly. Corby approached again and warned Ryland that previous tenants avoided the basement after a courier discovered an old backpack wedged behind a drain pipe. The courier returned the bag to the landlord, who claimed it belonged to a temporary worker, yet no one retrieved it. Ryland realized this detail lined up with the approximate time of Talon's disappearance. He asked Corby where the landlord moved and learned the man relocated to another county after selling the duplex in 2021. Ryland checked property records later that day and found a short transfer note indicating the landlord left behind several unclaimed storage boxes. Those boxes were marked as low priority during cleanup, which meant their contents might still sit in a small maintenance shed. Ryland walked to the shed behind the duplex and spotted 3 dust-covered boxes stacked under a sagging roof tile that drooped toward the canal. Inside one box, he found scattered papers, including an old shift sheet with Talon's name and a checklist mentioning repairs near the basement hatch. Another page listed a complaint about a foul smell rising through the floorboards after heavy rainfall. He took photos of the papers, then looked up when a sudden gust rattled the shed door hard enough to shake loose dried leaves. The wind pushed a loose shingle that clattered onto the ground near his feet and broke apart in a puff of dust. The noise startled him, but reminded him that the property had been poorly maintained for years, which supported the idea of an overlooked accident. Ryland returned to the basement and used a small pry bar from his cousin's toolbox to loosen the frame without causing obvious damage. The door opened with a dull crack that carried through the quiet yard like a tired breath escaping from a sealed room. A wave of stale air rolled out, followed by the faint scent of metal and wet soil. He stepped inside and turned his phone flashlight toward the far wall where the drainage pipe curved behind a pile of rotten boards. Something glittered near the edge of the light, and he reached down to pick up a crushed reflective jacket with a missing zipper. The reflective pattern matched the same glare seen on the figure in the original photograph. A small utility tag sewn to the jacket listed the initials TG, which aligned with Talon Griggs, and confirmed Rylan had found evidence connected to the missing worker. He dug through debris nearby and uncovered an old clipboard that held one final maintenance note describing a sudden collapse caused by shifting soil near the hatch. It suggested Talon was preparing to reinforce the area before something destabilized the ground. Rylan followed the damaged soil path toward a narrow cavity under the floor where water pooled during storms and carried loose items into deeper pockets of mud. He found scattered tools with dried corrosion that indicated the worker likely became trapped by collapsing debris during heavy rainfall. The shifting soil and poor structure could have hidden the incident from sight for years. He contacted local authorities who reopened the case and confirmed the basement conditions created a perfect scenario for an unnoticed accident involving a lone worker. Officers documented the findings and credited Rylan's persistence for revealing the long-ignored evidence that connected the photograph to the missing maintenance report. Corby watched from the fence with a quiet expression that mixed relief with sorrow. Weeks later, Rylan returned to the duplex before his cousin finished moving in and paused near the mailbox where he first found the photo. The rusted metal still leaned forward, as if trying to offer one final warning about secrets left unmanaged in quiet neighborhoods. He understood now that the image was not a threat, but a trace of someone trying to signal unfinished work. He placed a small flower near the fence, then stepped back toward his car while thinking about how easily small details vanish when people move on. The photograph no longer felt ominous because its message became clear through patient evidence and careful listening to forgotten reports. Rylan left with a quiet respect for the worker whose final shift had been frozen in that single frame. The stories. The archivist who decoded a warning inside a missing person file. In a small county records office tied to a quiet mountain town, a file about a long missing hiker raised concern. It arrived without explanation in a plain envelope with an outdated seal that looked wrong to the staff. Calder Rusk was 39 and worked as an archivist who handled old case materials with careful routine. He liked quiet tasks during long shifts and kept notes about unusual items that passed through his desk. He lived outside town and drove an old sedan that handled mountain roads well. His plan that day in early autumn was simple. He wanted to finish indexing property disputes from 2008 and leave before sunset. The envelope changed that plan with a sharp interruption. Its paper felt older than the date stamp, which claimed 2015. The handwriting on the label looked rushed and uneven, which bothered him in a way he could not explain. Inside the envelope sat a missing person report about a hiker named Ryan Halper, who vanished during late summer 2015. The file included faded prints that showed a trail near a power station that had closed years earlier, according to county logs. A short field note from an unnamed deputy was clipped inside the report, and that detail confused Calder. The deputy note carried a single line that read, "A warning was heard near the ridge before we lost contact." There was no signature and no follow-up page, which conflicted with what Calder had learned about normal procedure. He checked the index card drawer for the deputy roster from that year. He found a roster with a missing entry number that hinted at an unfiled edition. Calder decided to verify the report by checking archive dispatch summaries kept in a separate compact shelf. He pulled a binder marked Summer Cases 2015 and scanned each page with slow care. One entry mentioned a static-filled call from an officer near the old ridge trail where the hiker vanished. It noted that the call ended after a loud crack reported by dispatch staff. He compared the time of that call with a note in the missing person report and noticed a mismatch that felt important. The report claimed the call never connected, yet the dispatch summary claimed it lasted several minutes. He wrote both details in his notebook because he wanted a clear timeline. He planned to confirm the timestamps using recorded reel backups stored in a temperature-controlled locker below the office. The reel system was old but reliable and required a special key that he kept on a wrist chain for emergency work. He unlocked the cabinet and threaded the reel for the afternoon of the hiker disappearance. The recording started with normal chatter about trail conditions that matched weather logs filed that week. It shifted after a faint voice cut through the static, repeating a short phrase. The phrase sounded like "stay above the red markers," which made Calder pause because the trail maps from that year used blue markers. He replayed that section several times and heard a second voice say the markers were changed without notice earlier that month. He checked a laminated map from 2015 stored in a drawer down the hall. The map showed blue markers along the ridge, despite the comment on the reel. Calder wondered if someone updated the trail signs unofficially, which could confuse hikers unfamiliar with the area. He called a retired ranger named Ballen who sometimes answered questions about old trail conditions. Ballen told him that a volunteer crew repainted the ridge trail during late summer 2015 due to erosion damage. He added that the crew reported a missing paint supply that delayed work during the final week. This detail matched a line in the missing person report that mentioned a misplaced equipment crate near the ridge boundary. Calder believed the misplaced crate might explain the repainted markers if someone used the wrong color during rushed repairs. He added that thought to his notes and checked weather data again. He found that a storm hit the ridge that same evening, which might have washed away parts of the trail. He returned to the file and noticed a small fold at the corner of a photo that revealed another handwritten line. The line said the warning was not meant for us, which made him uneasy because it echoed the earlier note from the deputy. He held the photo under a desk lamp and saw faint indentations behind the words. The indentations looked like someone wrote a longer message on a removed page. Calder used a soft graphite stick to shade the back of the photo gently, which revealed fragments of a sentence. The fragments read trail shift noted after rails collapsed, which pointed to structural issues near the Ridge Power Station. He checked maintenance logs kept before the station closed in 2011. The logs confirmed repeated warnings about unstable railings near the ridge overlook. He suspected the missing hiker might have walked near that overlook after the storm started, which could explain the disappearance. He searched the envelope again and found a small memory card taped under the inner flap. The card held a short audio clip recorded by someone walking uphill during strong wind. The clip ended with the same phrase heard in the reel, "Stay above the red markers," spoken by a strained voice. Calder compared the wind noise from the clip with weather station data and concluded it matched the storm peak that evening. He realized the warning might have been directed at the volunteer crew who repainted the trail and not at search teams. The crew may have marked a detour with red signs that never made it onto the official map. That possibility explained the conflicting colors noted in the reel. He formed a theory that the hiker followed the new red markers, which led toward the unstable overlook rather than the safe path. The missing crate and rushed repairs might have contributed to poor placement of those temporary signs. Calder wrote a summary that connected the deputy note, the audio clip, and the map inconsistencies. He delivered the summary to his supervisor, who agreed to send it to county search coordinators for review. In the following days, a review team hiked the ridge and found remnants of weathered red paint on a fallen post near the overlook. They also found metal fragments that matched railings documented in the 2011 maintenance logs. These findings supported Calder's belief that the hiker followed an unofficial detour that collapsed during the storm. Calder knew the case remained unresolved, yet he felt the evidence finally clarified the warning inside the file. The message pointed to a rushed trail change that confused both hikers and responders back in 2015. As he closed the binder, he realized some files waited years for someone to read them in the right order. He locked the envelope in a secure drawer and left the office with a quiet sense of closure. The stories? A camper's forgotten tape exposed the real reason they closed the park. The old park had been shut for years after a string of unexplained incidents that locals still mentioned in quiet tones. The only solid clue ever discussed came from a small camcorder tape found inside a forgotten overnight pack near the North Trail. The story followed a 26-year-old school technician named Lyle Rooker, who visited the park in early autumn of 2019. He worked long weeks in a crowded lab and wanted one quiet weekend before the winter rush returned. He drove out early on a Friday, hoping to film some wildlife and maybe catch a quiet sunrise near the ridge. Lyle picked a simple loop near a small lake and planned to reach a clearing before dark so he could set up his camp. He checked the weather, loaded his pack, then started the trail with a relaxed pace that matched the quiet feel of the woods. The place had been thinning in visitors for years, and he enjoyed the stillness while he walked toward the lake. The incident started when he noticed a narrow side path marked only by faded blue tape tied around a leaning pine. He looked at his printed map and saw no hint of that path, even though it seemed recently used by something heavy. The ground showed deep impressions and a few dragged lines that he could not match with normal hiker traffic. Lyle moved closer to inspect the impressions, and he recorded a brief clip while he knelt near the dirt with the camcorder. Witness statements later noted that his voice sounded uneasy when he said he might return later to check the full length of the side path. He continued toward the lake, though he kept glancing back with a nervous expression that showed in later recovered frames. When he reached the clearing, he met a retired ranger named Colton Reeves, who often walked the trail for exercise. Colton warned him about stray dogs reported near the ridge and advised him to stay on the main path if he heard anything heavy moving. Lyle agreed, though he mentioned the strange impressions near the pine. Colton seemed unsettled by that detail and said he had not seen blue tape in that area before. That short exchange later became an important piece of the investigation because Colton described Lyle as alert and fully oriented. Dispatch logs showed that the ranger left the clearing around the same time Lyle began setting up his small tent beside the lake. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and he recorded a simple note saying he would return home early Sunday. The complication began when distant knocks echoed across the water after sunset. The tape captured 3 sharp hits, followed by a slow dragging sound that rolled through the trees. Lyle whispered a short question, asking if someone was swinging tools, but no voice answered before the sound faded. He stepped outside with the camcorder, and the footage trembled slightly while he walked toward the shoreline. That part of the tape showed ripples moving across the lake, though the surface looked calm seconds earlier. A dim shape crossed from right to left near the far bank, but the frame blurred before any exact detail formed. Investigators later judged the shape to be human-sized, though they could not confirm height or posture. Lyle backed away, and he ended the clip with a quick excuse that he needed more light. Evidence gathered from his tent indicated he tried to sleep but stayed awake most of the night. His pack remained open, and he had placed the camcorder near the entrance so he could reach it quickly. Around 2 in the morning, a second set of knocks started. The tape recorded them with clearer tone, and they sounded closer to the clearing than before. Lyle stepped out and aimed the camcorder toward the trees near the side path. The audio picked up cracking undergrowth along with short breaths that suggested he was frightened, yet still curious enough to film. Then a faint voice appeared near the edge of the microphone range. The voice asked if anyone had seen the dog from the ridge and repeated the question twice. Investigators matched the voice to a missing hiker reported 3 seasons earlier, according to archived calls. That hiker had vanished during a late storm near the North Trail, and his final message referenced a stray dog that followed him across the ridge. The match was considered probable, though never confirmed, because the audio was worn with age. Lyle walked a few steps toward the sound, though he kept enough distance for a quick retreat. The tape showed a tall figure standing between 2 pines with an odd tilt at the shoulders. The figure swayed slowly, as if injured, and the lower right side appeared fixed in a stiff angle. Lyle asked if the person needed help. The voice did not answer, and the figure moved further into the trees without showing its face. The investigation deepened when rangers found Lyle's camp untouched the following afternoon, with his tent still upright and his food sealed. His phone lay inside the tent with 2 attempted calls made around 3 that morning. The calls never connected due to weak signal. The camcorder was found near the base of the leaning pine where the faint blue tape had been tied. Search teams followed the side path and found more deep impressions along with a torn jacket fragment that matched the missing hiker's clothing from 3 seasons earlier. The fragment was caught on a low branch roughly 20 yards from where Lyle recorded the swaying figure. Soil samples indicated repeated movement through that area, though not enough to identify specific tracks. The twist emerged when investigators compared Lyle's final clip with an older wildlife survey recorded 6 years earlier. Both clips captured the same faint voice asking about the dog near the ridge. The survey team noted the voice, but assumed it came from campers beyond the tree line. The match suggested a pattern of someone or something calling from the same area across multiple years. The official report stated that the park remained unsafe due to unstable terrain near the North Trail and ongoing search efforts tied to older missing persons cases. Unofficially, several rangers believed the repeated voice signaled a person who wandered off the main path and survived through unknown means. They felt the figure avoided help and followed hikers who entered the side path after dark. Lyle was never found despite extensive searches that covered every marked route and several unmarked stretches. His camcorder tape became the final recorded clue, showing his calm approach that shifted to rising fear as the figure moved away. The park closed soon after officials reviewed the tapes and compared them with archived survey audio. The case left a quiet note in local reports stating that people sometimes leave trails for reasons no one fully understands. The forgotten tape remained the clearest glimpse into those final hours, and it shaped the quiet acceptance that the park would not reopen in the near future. The closing line on the internal report stated that some paths stay hidden for good reasons, and not every question finds a safe answer. The stories. This lakeside pier hides something no one reports. Lodge crews in the region still talk about an old pier tucked behind a quiet lake that draws almost no visitors. They say the pier looks normal from a distance, yet people keep finding strange evidence near its end that never reaches public reports. In the summer of 2019, a maintenance worker named Ryland Keating drove out to that lake for a simple task. He was 29 and worked routine grounds jobs for a small county crew. That day, he only needed to replace a warped board along the outer section of the pier. He liked the lake because it stayed calm even during busy seasons, and he figured the job would be quick enough to finish before lunch. When he parked near the tree line, he noticed the lot was empty, which felt odd because anglers usually arrived before dawn. The air felt thick, and the water looked darker than usual, yet he kept moving because the repair order had been waiting all week. He set his toolbox near the first post, then started walking along the pier to check for soft boards before carrying supplies to the far section. Halfway across, he heard a short knock against the underside of the pier, which he assumed came from drifting debris. He leaned over the edge to look for logs, but saw nothing moving. The sound happened again, just 2 boards ahead, and this time he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He stepped back and tried to decide if the pier was shifting because of wind, but the lake's surface stayed flat without any waves. He reached the final stretch where the railing changed from new planks to older, weathered pieces. A notebook sat against the inner corner near the last post, which made him freeze because the crew did not store items out there. The notebook looked soaked along the edges, and several pages had stuck together. He picked it up and flipped through the front until he found a name that he did not recognize. The entry mentioned fishing conditions from early spring and included a rough drawing of the lake that ended with a short line stating the water felt wrong that day. He set the notebook down and crouched to check the damaged board that needed replacing. When he pulled the old plank free, he spotted a small metal badge wedged between the beams. It had no markings other than deep scratch lines that looked deliberate. The badge felt cold and heavy despite the warm morning air. He wiped away dirt, then placed it inside his shirt pocket because he wanted to check county records later. Ryland returned to his truck for the replacement board and felt uneasy during the walk back because the knocking sound continued at irregular intervals. When he reached the trunk, he noticed mud streaks on his rear bumper that did not match his earlier tracks. The streaks started near the center, then curved down toward the gravel, as if someone had leaned against the vehicle. He looked around the empty lot and called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer came back. He carried the new plank to the end of the pier and installed it quickly because he wanted to leave. While tightening the final screw, he heard a voice from the tree line near the far side of the lake. The words were hard to understand, yet the tone sounded urgent. He turned and scanned the shoreline, but saw no movement except for a faint ripple near the reeds. He stood still and waited for another sound, then heard what he thought was the same voice repeating a short phrase. The wind picked up, which carried the sound across the water in a strange pattern that made it difficult to pinpoint the source. He packed his tools and walked back toward the lot. Before reaching the shore, he noticed footprints near the first post that looked fresh. They were smaller than his boots and pressed deeply into the wood, which suggested someone had been standing there minutes earlier. He followed the prints for a short distance until they looped back toward the reeds and stopped abruptly where the boards felt damp. When Ryland returned to the office, he turned in the repair report and mentioned the found notebook and badge. His supervisor asked him to set both items on a side shelf until someone from records could examine them. That afternoon, the supervisor checked archival calls for that area and found references to an unconfirmed missing angler from early spring. The angler had signed in at the visitor kiosk but never signed out. Crews searched the lake for 2 days, then scaled back when no solid evidence surfaced. Later that week, Ryland decided to look deeper into the notebook. He flipped through more pages and discovered entries describing odd pressure changes near the pier on quiet days. One entry detailed a single ripple moving against the wind and stopping precisely under the pier. Another entry described faint tapping at night that sounded mechanical. None of the entries suggested danger, but the tone shifted in the final pages as the writer mentioned seeing a person standing near the reeds who vanished before he could wave. Ryland checked weather logs for the period mentioned in the notebook, and noted a rare drop in barometric pressure that occurred without a storm. He also examined an old photo stored in his phone from a visit months earlier. In the photo, the lake looked normal, yet a small shape near the reeds reflected more light than surrounding water. He zoomed in and noticed a faint outline that resembled a shoulder above the surface. He thought it might be a lighting artifact, but decided to keep the image for reference. A week later, he returned to the lake with a coworker named Laramie Downs, who handled safety inspections. Laramie was older with years of field experience and usually dismissed odd reports, yet she agreed to help because she remembered the missing angler case. They arrived early and walked the length of the pier while checking for structural issues. Laramie tapped each beam with a small tool to test for hollow spots. When she reached the section where Rylan had found the badge, she paused because the sound changed. The beam gave a dull response, like something heavy sat under the structure. Rylan lay flat on the boards and lowered his arm to feel beneath the edge. His fingers touched a cold object that felt like metal. He reached further and pulled out a thin plate with holes drilled along one side. It looked like part of an old sonar bracket, but the lake had no recorded installations. Laramie suggested checking old maintenance logs from 2005 because the county once considered adding depth sensors for safety. She also noted the plate looked corroded only on one half, which indicated it had been partially shielded from water for a long time. They carried the plate to the truck and decided to walk the shoreline before leaving. Near the reeds, they found a small indentation in the mud that resembled a knee print next to a flattened patch of grass. The mark faced the lake as if someone had been kneeling to look at something. Laramie pointed out faint parallel lines near the water, which looked like drag marks. She photographed the area, then flagged it for a follow-up survey. Back at the office, Rylan compared the bracket plate with old schematics from a short-lived depth monitoring trial. He found a drawing showing 2 test brackets installed near the pier before the project was canceled. The logs stated the devices were removed after several malfunctions, but the final report accounted for only 1 bracket. The missing bracket had apparently fallen into the lake or been removed without documentation. The scratch lines on the badge matched the spacing of the holes on the plate, which suggested they had been stored or moved together at some point. Rylan checked weather sensors near the lake for unusual readings over the past year. Several early morning reports showed sharp changes in water temperature near the pier despite stable air conditions. He also found a dispatch log from late spring describing a caller who reported seeing a person waving near the reeds before disappearing under the surface. Responders searched but found no footprints and concluded the caller may have seen a bird landing. One night, Rylan returned to the lake alone because he wanted to verify something noted in the notebook. He walked to the end of the pier and stood still, listening for tapping. The lake stayed quiet until a single knock sounded beneath the beams exactly where he had felt vibration weeks earlier. He crouched and waited, then heard a softer knock that echoed against the metal bracket he had removed. He realized the sound pattern resembled the rhythm of small waves hitting a barrier, which made little sense in calm water. He shined a flashlight into the gap where the bracket had been and saw a narrow space that opened into a small cavity under the pier. Something metallic glinted near the back wall. He reached with a long rod and pulled out a rusted hinge attached to a bent bar. The pieces looked like remnants of an improvised tool. He placed the hinge on the deck, then noticed a wet footprint forming near the end post. The shape appeared in seconds, as if someone had stepped there recently. The board around it stayed dry while the footprint darkened. Rylan backed away slowly and pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved, and the air stayed silent. He waited for the footprint to fade, but it held shape for several minutes before drying unevenly. He documented the scene with his phone, then left the lake without waiting for more signs. Weeks later, the county closed the pier for extended maintenance and sealed the logs from public access. The missing angler case remained unresolved, yet several notes were added stating unexplained structural anomalies had been found near the outer section. Rylan kept copies of the notebook entries and the photo of the bright shoulder shape. He never returned to the lake, but told coworkers the pier held a mix of forgotten equipment and quiet warnings that did not reach official channels. He believed the clues pointed to someone spending secret time under the structure long before the angler disappeared. He also believed the knocking he heard came from shifting metal against trapped beams rather than anything mystical. Still, the unexplained footprint remained the detail he never understood. Today, the lake sits quiet behind dense trees, and the pier shows new boards that look identical to the old ones. Locals say nothing strange happens there anymore, and officials agree. Ryland thinks the place carries its own quiet trail of missed signs, and he hopes they stay buried where they cause no more stories. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. The final log from a lighthouse on a foggy coast. A faded coastal report from 2008 mentions an unsigned log found inside a shuttered lighthouse during routine maintenance. Workers said it looked recent, even though the building had been locked for years. The discovery triggered a quiet review that centered on one man named Corin Halbrook, who once served as the tower caretaker. Corin was 39 and worked as a part-time dockhand in a nearby fishing town, and he checked the old structure whenever storms rolled through. He liked the quiet building, and he felt responsible for keeping it safe because his late father had worked there decades earlier. On a cold morning in early autumn, he headed out with a simple goal, which was to finish a roof inspection before the fog returned. He hiked the narrow path with his tool pack, and he noticed the fog drifting in faster than expected. A supply boat sounded its horn, and the echo pulled his attention to shifting shapes that moved across the water. He reached the lighthouse door and found fresh scrape marks on the metal surface, and that detail threw off his routine. Inside, he heard a soft clatter from the watchroom above, and he paused because no one should have been there. He climbed the steep stairs, and the air felt heavier with each step because the tower trapped the fog that seeped through old seams. When he reached the top landing, he noticed a lantern lit on the small desk, and he knew he had not left it there earlier that week. He read the open logbook and saw an entry written in a neat hand that did not match his script. The note described a boat drifting without lights near the shoals, and the timestamp matched the previous night. Corin wondered who had written it, and he checked the radio shelf and found a handheld set powered on with low battery. He stepped outside to scan the water, and the fog swallowed most of the horizon except for a dim shape moving slowly near the rocks. He raised his binoculars and saw what looked like an old skiff listing toward a channel notorious for hidden ledges. He called a warning through the radio, and he waited for a response that never came. When he hurried back inside, he noticed another fresh line in the logbook, and it read that the skiff had no operator visible on deck. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed, and Corin felt a jolt because the ink looked wet. He checked the stairs and heard faint steps descending, even though no one passed him on the landing. He followed the sound to the service room, and he found a damp jacket draped over a chair that had been dry earlier that week. The pockets held a small notebook with water stains, and the pages carried brief notes about frequent, low fog and strange lights near the channel. The most recent note mentioned a voice over the water calling for help, and Corin closed the book because the air suddenly felt colder. He decided to document the building for safety, and he used his small camera to take photos of the fresh marks on the door and the lit lantern. He moved room to room, and he captured the damp jacket along with the notebook because he wanted evidence for the harbor office. When he checked the time, he noticed the fog outside turning a darker shade, and that sign suggested another weather shift. He stepped out on the gallery to examine the water, and he heard a low groan coming from the direction of the shoals. He could not see the skiff anymore, and the silence that followed pressed against his nerves. He returned to the watchroom and prepared to close the logbook, and that was when he noticed a final half-written entry near the bottom of the page. The unfinished line described a man on the gallery waving toward the tower, and Corin froze because he realized he had just been on that same walkway. He checked the door and found it closed tight, and he felt sure no one had entered while he moved through the rooms. He read the last words again, and the implication unsettled him more than any storm he had faced. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log, discovered months later, matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believe the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories. Never open the locker marked "staff only" at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claim the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "staff only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with two knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Rylan decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Rylan tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Rylan jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Rylan insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Rylan described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Rylan eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. The bus route no driver volunteers for anymore. Mason Kiernan had heard about Route 74 from older drivers who spoke in quiet tones that never carried far. They said the trouble started in the late 2010s after a strange series of reports reached dispatch. Nothing dramatic was proven, yet every account shared the same route and the same stretch of road. Mason was 34 with 6 years on the job, and he handled his shifts without much worry. He covered suburban loops near a quiet industrial strip, and most days followed a predictable pattern. He enjoyed the routine since it felt steady and harmless. When his supervisor asked him to cover Route 74 one cloudy afternoon, he agreed before he remembered the warnings. He showed up early at the depot that day, hoping to review the old logbooks stored in a dusty metal drawer near the operations office. The previous drivers had left short notes that felt rushed and uneasy. One entry from late 2016 mentioned a recorded thump on the rear exterior panel that matched no visible damage. Another entry filed in early 2018 reported an unknown passenger leaving muddy prints that ended halfway down the aisle. Mason drove out a little before 4 that afternoon. The route crossed through residential blocks before curving toward the old mill road that ran along an abandoned railway cut. He planned to complete the loop without focusing on the rumors. The bus felt solid, and the passengers were few. A pair of teenagers sat near the middle seats while an elderly man checked his phone with slow movements. The incident started as Mason merged onto the mill road. His side mirror reflected something darker than the usual late daylight. He caught a shape near the tree line that looked like a person leaning slightly forward. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it was nothing unusual, since shadows often stretched strangely near wooded areas. Still, he noticed the elderly man glancing toward the same window, as if he had sensed something too. A mile later, the teenagers hit the stop cord. Mason opened the doors, and they stepped out onto a fading concrete pad. As the doors shut, one of them tapped the glass and pointed toward the rear of the bus. Mason reversed the angle of his mirror and saw a smear across the lower panel. It looked wet, like someone dragged a hand along the metal. He checked the road behind him and saw no one there. The teenagers shrugged before walking away. Mason continued toward the loop turn, focusing on the sound of the engine. The noise seemed slightly off-pitch. He kept his speed steady, but sensed a weight shift near the rear section. The elderly passenger moved closer and asked if everything was all right. Mason told him the engine felt warm but stable. The man nodded and mentioned hearing a hollow tapping near the back wall. At the final stop of the loop, the elderly man stepped out, leaving Mason alone for the return run. He checked the exterior panel and found the smear dry like dust pressed by a damp glove. The shape continued a few inches beyond the edge, as if the contact started slightly off the surface. He wiped it with his sleeve and felt grainy residue flake away with an odd metallic smell. He climbed back inside and started the engine. The interior lights flickered once as the gear engaged. He made it halfway up the hill before a heavy thud sounded near the emergency exit. He braked and listened. Another softer thud followed, like something shifting its weight. He walked down the aisle with slow steps and checked each row. The seats were empty, and the air felt colder than it should for that hour. Near the back seat, he noticed a set of partial prints on the floor. They were narrower than a normal shoe, but shaped like someone walking with uneven pressure. The prints stopped exactly where previous notes claimed they ended. He crouched low and found a fragment of dried soil that did not match the usual clay from the area. It held a reddish tint closer to iron dust from the old mill yard. Mason reached dispatch through the radio and reported the noises. The operator told him to return the bus for inspection, since archived calls from earlier years mentioned similar sounds. He kept the radio open as he returned to the wheel. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. On the way back, he passed the same hill where he had seen the shadow near the trees. The mirror caught movement again. This time, he saw a figure standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder. The figure wore something loose that blended with the background. The face seemed pale, though he could not see details clearly. The figure vanished between glances without any sign of retreat. A minute later, a faint tapping started along the rear exterior. It rose in 3 short bursts that matched a steady rhythm. He recognized a pattern similar to someone hitting metal to test thickness. He held the wheel tight and kept driving until the depot gates came into view. Mechanics met him near the garage. They checked the exterior and found thin scratches near the rear panel that shaped a curved line not caused by branches. The residue he had wiped earlier fell into a small tray and produced a metallic odor stronger than before. One mechanic mentioned that earlier logs described identical residue after drivers reported seeing a lone figure near the mill road in late 2017. The supervisor asked Mason to retrace the interior for any objects left behind. He searched each row with a handheld light. Near the same spot where the prints ended, he found a torn strip of cloth hanging from the seat frame. It felt oddly cold, even under the warm light. The cloth carried the same reddish tint as the soil fragment. Later that night, the depot reviewed old dash recordings from previous years. Most footage showed nothing more than faint reflections. However, one clip from mid-2019 captured a blurred outline moving along the side of a passing bus. The outline kept pace for several seconds before fading near the same hill where Mason saw the figure. Investigators compared the footage with archived local reports. They found mention of a worker who disappeared near the mill site in late 2015. The report never confirmed foul play, and the search ended without results. There was no official link connecting that case to the strange events on the route, yet the timing matched the earliest driver notes. Mason stayed quiet as the supervisor reviewed the findings. The bus still sat idling with a low rumble that hummed through the concrete floor. A mechanic tapped the rear panel and noted that the metal vibrated oddly like a surface recently struck from the outside. Another mechanic mentioned hearing a faint echo that felt delayed by half a second. The depot decided to suspend Route 74 until the buses could be tested. Drivers whispered that the figure near the hill might be tied to the worker who vanished years earlier. No one claimed solid proof, yet the pattern of sightings, sounds, and residue lined up too closely to ignore. The supervisor circulated a memo explaining that the route posed operational risks due to repeated, unexplained interference. Mason drove home that night feeling the weight of everything he had seen. He replayed the moment when the figure appeared in the mirror. He tried to decide if it looked like a person seeking help or a shape formed by shifting shadows. The cloth fragment still felt cold in his memory, though he never touched it again. In the weeks after the suspension, several commuters asked why the route closed. Officials told them the road required maintenance due to instability near the railway cut. Only a few people mentioned the old rumors. Some said they once saw someone walking the hill at dusk, though none described a clear face. Mason returned to his regular loop and kept his focus on safe runs. He never requested Route 74 again. Whenever the topic surfaced among drivers, he listened quietly without adding his story. He knew what he had heard and seen on that road. He also knew that the evidence, while thin, repeated across years with unsettling consistency. The depot finally retired the buses assigned to that route. They stored them in a corner lot away from the main garage. On calm nights, staff claimed to hear soft taps on the panels as if something moved inside the old shells. No one investigated because the sound stopped whenever a door opened. Each time Mason passed the lot, he felt a chill rise along his arms. He believed the events were real, even if no official report could confirm them. Route 74 remained closed, and no driver stepped forward to revive it. The story faded from public view, yet those who worked at the depot understood why the route stayed empty. They remembered how it felt to sense a presence following the bus, and they knew some roads carry histories that never fully settle.